that or not. Uh,
Yeah, sure. I mean, assuming I can get it up and going, I'll keep an eye on it.
okay. I mean, I could pull it up too, but I don't know. I mean, it just seems like the way this window is working, it might be better for you. We can take some questions in there. If you keep that chat window open, then and alert me to any questions, just interrupt me or whatever. That would be amazing.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I
So,
can see. I'll see if I can get it running here.
so one of the amazing things about you, as I've often said, is that sometimes I can outsource my brain to you. You know, so I'm hoping you can give me a full tutorial on this Seymour Hersh bin Laden stuff, some of the background, some of what's been going on, because I know I mean I know you, so I know you've been following it very very closely, right?
Yeah, of
Whereas
course.
I've been involved in all these other things going on, and I still haven't read the Hersh article. I have a vague outline of what's happening. I mean, how serious is this for the empire? How credible is the story? What does it mean for this sort of historical narrative of the U.S. Capture of bin Laden.
Well, so I think I want to start with that, and I'm still screwing around trying to get the chat room open here while I'm
Okay.
talking to you. But I think I want to start with that. The reaction to Hirsch. I mean, all you need to know is that there's the official story of the killing of bin Laden, and Hirsch has come out with this piece that says that it's virtually entirely a lie, that that's not how it happened at all, that he died there that day, but other than that, it's all a bunch of bunk. And then the reaction to that is like he, said that the Virgin Mary was in fact not a virgin at all. Like, right? He had gone straight at the heart of the civic religion of the state. I mean, what is it good for anyway? Well, they did hunt down and kill that one guy finally, right? And so we can cheer USA for that. And I don't know where they got the students to come out in front of the White House and chant USA for that, but they found them. And it's hurtful, Jeff Tucker. It's hurtful to say that something as important and symbolic as the Navy SEALs, right? SEAL Team 6 and all this straight out of the comic book, that they went and got this guy in the way that they did in this, Jessica Lynch heroic, special forces raid kind of a way that they
Does
did.
this all
And
come from the movie? Is this all from the movie Zero Dark something?
sure, yeah, and I mean the lies were tailor-made for a movie, basically, right? This is, uh, basically to make up for the fact that everything they do makes our terrorism problem worse. At least they could say, well, we finally got that one guy for you, I guess. Anyway, the only point I'm getting at is look at the way they attack Hirsch. All right, I mean, none of these reporters ever attack each other like this for carrying on the state's narrative. But you challenge the state's narrative, and from a position of such authority as being Seymour Hersh, who's the daddy of all real investigative journalists in this country, and they all know it. They all have to praise him before they attack him, even when they're attacking him. It's a huge thing. I mean, his story that Turkey and al-Nusra were basically trying to frame up Assad for the sarin gas attack of August 2013 that almost led to a war then. They basically just ignored that. And that was a big deal story. But they basically just ignored it right out of there. Let's just pretend that never happened, basically. That didn't make the TV news or whatever. But with this bin Laden story, I guess I'm just repeating myself. But you could see how, people in the media just went completely crazy over this because they played the role of Mina Bird for whatever the state said happened there, and including, like you said, the Hollywood movie that depicts this entire thing entirely different from the
So
real truth.
what is his narrative, and how does it differ from the
Okay, so right,
official?
let's do it. Okay, so the official story is that the CIA brilliantly tortured a guy, and then that led to the name of a courier, and then they tracked a courier to this Bin Laden safe house in Abbottabad, and that the Americans basically just figured it out, deduced that he was there, and then knowing they couldn't trust the ISI that may or may not have been in on keeping him there, the ISI, that's the Pakistani CIA basically, they decided to send in the Special Forces, SEAL Team 6, in two Black Hawk helicopters to raid the place, and kill the guy. There was a big firefight. They shot a bunch of couriers and bodyguards and whatever. And then all the details, even from the very beginning, they were raising and then dropping details as they were disproven and contradicted. But they said for a time he had hid behind his wife and that he had fired an AK-47 and all of this. So what Hersh says is that basically none of that's true. He was living there, but he was living there because ISI was keeping him there under house arrest. And that one of their top guys basically broke ranks and walked into the CIA and said, I know where bin Laden is, give me the money and bring my family to America and I'll tell you where he is. And then he tipped them off. And that then they basically called out the Saudis, the Pakistanis, and said, we know that you've been keeping him, and so now you're going to help us get him. And so then they went in and did the raid, but it was basically stage managed like the Jessica Lynch thing, where there was no opposition in sight. And the Pakistanis kept all the airplanes back and didn't do anything about the helicopters violating their airspace, and kept all the local police and local firefighters and local whatever first responders and that kind of thing back from the scene during the raid. They went in there and they shot him. And then instead of dumping his body at sea, they actually, the SEALs themselves were, according to Hersh, kind of just joshing around and going, ha, look at me, oops, I accidentally threw his hand out the door. Hard for you to get a proper Islamic burial now, huh, chump, kind of thing. And that they were basically just desecrating his body through bits and pieces of it out the door. And then there's a discrepancy here because he says in the article, or at least his copy editor, Final Draft, says in the article, the body was last seen with the CIA, and that the burial at sea on the Vinson never happened. The USS Vinson, Carl Vinson, never happened. When I asked him about that, he said, I didn't write that. I don't know what you're talking about. Now I got to go. So
oh, really?
I don't know exactly. I guess, in fact, what he said was, no, it did go to the Vinson, but it didn't go into the water.
What do you mean when you asked him about that? Did you have him on your show?
Yeah, I had him on my show a week ago today.
Oh, that's so incredibly cool. How did you land that? I mean, you just wrote him?
Well, yeah, I've kind of interviewed him off and on for the last 10 years because he was really good on the neocons and the Mujahideen Khalq and all this great stuff back, in 2005. And the wife is friends with him. And so, and now, so here's the thing too. His story is partially corroborated by Carlotta Gall from the New York Times, who says that was her information too, that she never published, but that she believed that the Pakistanis were keeping him there basically under house arrest. And then there's another story that was published actually back in 2011 by a blogger named Hillhouse, who had said that, basically the same story. And then NBC News and The National in Pakistan also came out and said it was not the courier. Never mind that it was torturing a guy into naming a courier. That's, talk about a bridge too far. That's completely made up. And they're saying, no, it wasn't even a courier at all. It was this walk-in from the Pakistani ISI. So that's partial corroboration. And,
I mean, the whole story sounds. I mean, just hearing you tell it, it sounds much more normal and much more, sort of like plausible. I mean, that's sort of the way.
Yeah, because how do you fly in 2 Black Hawks and then eventually 2 more helicopters, Chinooks? The big double helicopters, troop carrier things. How do you do that without having the generals in charge of the Pakistani military on the phone and saying, listen, don't shoot down our helicopters or we're going to be really pissed off, man? I mean, they're not going to take that kind of risk of sneaking in there and doing it. And then, so Hersh says, the Pakistanis had their own incentives for playing down their role. If the Americans wanted to blame the Pakistanis, they didn't mind because they were double-crossing the Saudis who'd been paying them to keep bin Laden, and they were double-crossing Al-Qaeda, who they were keeping bin Laden. That was part of Hersh's version anyway, was that they were basically saying to Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban, we've got your guy, so you better not cross too many of our lines or whatever because we'll kill him, kind of thing. And so since they had double-crossed him to both the Saudis and the local Al-Qaeda types, they decided they would go along with the American narrative that it was this big heroic mission and all of this.
So apparently, and so after he publishes the story, and I read too about the New York Times reporter and several others saying, yeah, some version of that has sort of been on the street for a while, but nobody published it until now. So that's very interesting to me, that the people who are sort of paid to know things and paid to write things, and their life is this world, would have heard this story for a while. I mean, even for them, the Seymour Hersh story was not a revelation, really. I mean,
Right.
that's kind of, I mean, that's really interesting to me. I mean, I'm intrigued by that. Just how something can be like a convention among the professionals that never enters into the public, that doesn't enter into the public
Well,
mind.
you know what it is?
Everybody talks about it, sort of at cocktail parties and that sort of thing.
Right.
The
Well,
whispers.
I can't speak for Carlotta Gall and New York Times reporters and that kind of thing, but my wife is an investigative reporter, and part of the thing is there's a lot of things that she knows that she can't report because she promised that she wouldn't report it if they would tell her on background, this or that kind of thing. Then there are other things that she thinks she knows, but she only has one good source, and she can't go with one good source. She'd have to wait until she has somebody else to tell her. And she might even, she has to second guess herself too. If she thinks she has, like for example, Carlotta Gall is saying, well, I think that, okay, maybe I'm putting words in her mouth, but more or less she's saying, I didn't have enough to publish this myself, but I can help corroborate Hersh, right?
Yeah.
Well, the question is raised there, maybe Hersh heard this from the same people as her, and so maybe she's actually not corroborating him, maybe she's actually just doubling up on the same source. So it can be complicated, right?
Yeah,
and in fact, I'll go ahead and tell this story here because what the hell, I don't care. I hope I don't get, cause too much of a problem. I talked about it on the radio show. But my wife actually had this story, major parts of this story, Jeff, right after it happened in the spring of 2011. And I actually have the story that she submitted to Raw Story and that they rejected and didn't publish. And then for different reasons, she basically, gave up on journalism at that point and didn't publish it anywhere.
Yeah.
Story, it didn't have about the courier or the lack of courier, but it did have the part about the Pakistanis were in on the raid and helped coordinate the raid with the Americans, helped turn off the electricity in the town, and in fact even turn the lights off periodically for a month leading up to it, so that when the lights went off that night, it wouldn't be that alarming of a thing. Kept the local police and first responders back, and then also, and I guess she didn't have this part of the story written yet. This was supposed to be part 2, but she also had that the Saudis were paying protection money basically to the Pakistanis to keep them there. But that, yeah, and that first of all, that the Pakistanis, some at least factions of the ISI, were keeping him there. So I bring that up not to brag about her, but in context, I mean, yeah, I do get to brag about her that she actually had this story first, even though it's kind of silly to do so because it's not published. So I can't really brag about her having it because it's not a published story. But I tell you that to explain part of the problem of having editors and part of the problem of having anonymous sources and maybe not enough of them.
Well,
and then also, but it also does help, I think, to corroborate Hersh's story because Larissa had it like 3 months before that blogger Hill House ever came out with it.
Well, there's also an element here, when a conventional narrative becomes sort of part of a civic doctrine, big time movie, everybody believes it. There's an element of uncertainty and fear associated with sort of contradicting that, Yeah, I can tell you. This is a totally trivial example, but I remember in the college I attended my senior year, the old Main, which is the main building on campus, burned down, and everybody immediately suspected the president. But it was an insurance fraud case because the university was deeply in debt, and everybody corroborated that story. I mean, like all the professors in the university believed it. It was always a whispering campaign, and basically everybody knows that was true. I mean, basically everybody believed that he burned it down, and there was every reason. There was a ton of evidence that he had. But what was amazing about this, I mean, this is going way back in my personal history, but the speculation to that effect never once appeared in any public venue. I mean, the local paper editorial never said that this is the rumor on the street. There's never an article in the newspaper. It was never discussed on the radio. I mean, so for the hoi polloi, for all they knew, it was electrical fire. But anybody who was anywhere close to the situation knew that the president of the university had burned it down. I mean, to this day, nobody talks about it. There was even years later a piece of historical fiction was written by a professor at the university that had the president burning down the building. So, I mean, or a fictional college campus in which the president of the university. So it was a very early lesson to me to how something can become a conventional sort of narrative for public consumption, and yet all the insiders sort of know that it's fake and have some version of the real story, and yet it never enters into public life, at all, through a very complex dynamic of sort of fear, betrayal of sources, lack of people willing to go, public with things, and so on and so on. So it's just fascinating that all these years later, then Seymour Hersh just comes out with something that was sort of seemed to have been rather well known, actually.
Parts of it, anyway, yeah. And now I think, as far as the burial at sea, nobody has really contradicted that except him, as far as I know, major journalists on the record with sources contradicting that. But I don't know anybody who believes it, that they just dumped his body in the ocean and that was the end of that. No way. And I'm gonna go ahead and say my kooky theory. I think that they cut his head off and brought it to the Skull and Bones crypt at Yale, like Geronimo's skull. They even called him Geronimo. And I think his head was George Bush's prize. I'm just making that up, you understand? Old Temporary. That was his Skull and Bones name, Temporary. But Bush had said, and this part is supposedly not disputed as far as I know, that Bush had told Cofer Black back in 2001, bring me his head in a box on dry ice, and that was the initial order to kill him and cut his head off and bring it back to the Bushes. His grandfather even got sued for digging up Geronimo's corpse and stealing his skull.
Yeah, hey, Scott, can
as long as I'm going to say crazy stuff, I'm going to try to back it up a little bit. And again admit that I just totally making that up. I just believe it.
Yeah, it's by the way not crazy. I've read the book about Skull and Bones. I mean,
Yeah, me too. Sutton.
Sutton's funny book. I mean, he makes too much of a big deal out of it, and all these conspiracy theories are a little bit wacky, and yet, like, weirdly true too. So I don't know. I tend to think of these kinds of conspiracy theories as not so much dark and brooding and scary and ominous, but just sort of a description of the way the ruling class works. I mean, it's rather plain. The ruling class doesn't imagine that they're really involved in some dark conspiracy to destroy the world. They just think that they're living out Aristotle's politics, basically. They just think the elite should rule through lies, and there should be entrenched hierarchies, and they're on the top, and they're the philosopher kings, and everybody else is in a position of subjection.
What's the problem?
Basically. What's the problem? That otherwise we'd have chaos. I mean, that's sort of the way they think of it, and you gradually ascend up the ranks of the ruling class and get revealed more and more information, and so Skull and Bones is kind of one of the central gatherings of the ruling class. It's not. Here's the other problem with this sort of.
You think it still is or was?
Well, I mean, certainly they believe they are. But there are many.
My best information about them was a long time ago, though.
Yeah. Well, there are many centers of the ruling class, but the other mistake that a lot of these sort of birchy, cranky conspiracy theorists make is they think that the problem is the Skull and Bones, or the problem is the Trilateral Commission, or the real problem is the Bilderbergers, or whatever. But actually, these are just kind of vessels. I mean, the real problem is the ruling class. I mean, these are just sort of central gathering. It's not as if we get rid of Skull and Bones, we get rid of the problem of the ruling class.
Right.
Hey, let me ask you something.
$1 trillion a year state either.
Right. Well, let me ask you something. As long as you're willing to go out on a limb and talk about crazy stuff, I wonder if you could give me your very frank and very well-informed opinion, if you're willing, on bin Laden's personal culpability in the events of 9/11?
I think he did it.
What do you mean he did it? What does that actually mean?
Well, so he inherited the group from Afghanistan that was the Azam group. Abdul Azam was the leader of the group, and he was killed, and bin Laden took it over. And he merged his group with Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was Ayman al-Zawahiri, the doctor's group. And so I don't know exactly, I forget now, I guess, exactly at what point the two groups more or less became one. But the group that started off in America attacking, they assassinated Rabbi Kahane. Do you remember him? The right-wing nationalist, really a fascist Israeli rabbi. They assassinated him in 1989. And then that was the start of it. It was the same little group that then blew up the World Trade Center, which the FBI could have stopped but failed to stop. That's maybe another story. And then the same group had the plan to blow up the UN, the Lincoln Tunnel, and the Holland Tunnel, and all of that. And then supposedly bin Laden's name first surfaces in counterterrorism around then, that he was donating to the defense fund for these guys in the Lincoln and Holland Tunnel and UN plot. And then later they prosecuted Youssef, the bomber, for the World Trade Center. Anyway, so that's when his name first starts surfacing as, you know, financing all of this. But then in 1996, he issued this fatwa, and he did interviews with CNN, with Peter Arnett and Peter Bergen, and then later with John Miller of ABC News and a couple of others. And he explained that basically you guys are the target, because you guys are behind everything that we're fighting against. And so shortly after that was the attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, which killed 19 American airmen. And I don't know if there's a way to turn that. Oh, there is a way to turn sound off on there. And then they blew up the embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya in 1998. And then they did an attempted attack on a battleship that failed because the dinghy sank. But then they did blow up the Cole in the year 2000, although they failed at their LAX plot because a Border Patrol agent at the Canadian border near Vancouver got lucky and just said, boy, it's pretty cold out here and you're sweating, Arab guy. You want to open your trunk for me there, buddy? And looked in his trunk, and there was explosives and a map to LAX and all of this stuff. So that got busted. And so, you know, in other words, like, these guys are a real movement. They'd been around. They'd been attacking the United States for a long time. And it was the same meeting, actually, in Malaysia where they planned the Cole attack that they planned the 9/11 attack, or at least, you know, not down to every nitty-gritty or whatever, but that was the big part of the Malaysia meeting.
You think that bin Laden was actually involved in selecting the guys who flew the planes, and he had, you know, complete foreknowledge?
I think partially because there's video of there's video of the lead hijacker Mohammed Atta and his buddy Ramzi bin al-Shibh in Afghanistan with bin Laden. Now, I guess it's possible that George Lucas, you know, whipped up some industrial light and magic, but I don't believe so. And that, you know, the story was this group of would-be terrorists living in Hamburg, Germany, went to Afghanistan to train, and then they were noticed because they had Western passports and were working on advanced degrees, and so would, you know, would have a chance to be allowed inside the United States, and so were selected. And there's some good books about this. You know, I never read the 9/11 Commission report this whole time, but there are books by Peter Lance, wrote 1,000 Years for Revenge. There's James Bamford wrote A Pretext for War and The Shadow Factory, both with impeccable sourcing. Leading up to that, there's Perfect Soldiers by Terry McDermott, the biography of the Hamburg cell of the hijackers. And yeah, now there's huge scandal and huge cover-up in the fact that the CIA did not tell the FBI about real-ass Al-Qaeda in the country who did the attack. And in fact, for that matter, I don't know this, again, because I never read it myself, but my understanding is the letters NSA don't even appear in the 9/11 Commission report. And that's only because if they told the truth about it, it would be, you know, there would have to be trials because of the amount of data, you know, very important stuff on Al-Qaeda that the NSA was not sharing with the CIA or the FBI.
And you think,
all these guys hate each other, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's huge scandal in that. And in fact, here's one more scandal that that I think, you know, kind of all the silly stuff obscures, and that is that Rudy Giuliani put the emergency command center at Building 7 at the World Trade Center, the most obvious terrorist target in America that had already been attacked with a truck bomb. And every professional tried to stop him and tried to get him to put it at Brooklyn or Queens or somewhere far away. And he said, no, I want to be able to walk there from my office.
Yeah.
So he put the damn command center right there. Well, so what are the consequences of that? The consequences of that are all the dead firefighters, because you can hear the audio from the police helicopters saying, whoa, man, the top is all moving around and creaking and is, you know, unstable. Everybody out, all NYPD out of the building right now. It's coming down. Well, there was nobody at the emergency command center, which had been evacuated, to turn around and tell that to the firefighters who were on a different frequency, because Rudy Giuliani was forced to go parade around in the street like a hero when he was actually, what, parading around, doing nothing, and unable to coordinate the information that the police in their helicopter had above with the firefighters inside the building, which cost them time that many of them could have used to get out of the building. So that's a major scandal, right? Like, that's the kind of thing where, all things being equal, Giuliani's head would have rolled over that. But instead, everybody's running around chasing every kind of ridiculous conspiracy about it. And you know what? I'll say this for the conspiracy stuff. And I should have said this in the first place, I guess. I suspect that the Saudi intelligence agency or agencies were, you know, working to make sure this thing was successful. And I think I give it at least some kind of double-digit chance that Dick Cheney and the Republicans had an understanding with the Saudis that we're going to do this, we're going to let the first attack through so that we can get on with it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, but I can't prove that, and mostly I can't because all the good information is buried under a bunch of nonsense. So now I've made myself an enemy of every 9/11 truther, but that's my
you know, these, you know, it's funny. I bumped into, there's a group of 9/11 truthers in Atlanta, I believe. I think they exist in every town, and you know, they're nice people. They actually have sort of a passion for justice, and they want to know the truth. And I actually think that everybody, even the leadership, the intellectual leadership of the 9/11 truth movement, is deeply sincere. You know. So I don't know enough about it, but I see, you know, what happens is if there's enough incomplete information, people get carried away and start weaving, you know, wild tales, when really the truth is usually one of incompetence and misinformation and miscommunication, and to some extent some moral culpability for failure to share intelligence. That's more or less the story of Pearl Harbor, for example. You know. Mm.
Yeah, and you know, I'll tell you, my very favorite 9/11 truther is a guy named Ray Nowaleski. And I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong. It's one of them Polish names. But it's something like Nowaleski. And in fact, he's friends with the wife, and she helped produce. For those not familiar, my wife, Larissa Alexandrovna, was an investigative reporter for many years for rawstory.com, mostly in the Bush years. But anyway, so she helped make the documentary 9/11 Press for Truth, which is the story of the Jersey girls who pushed to get the 9/11 Commission investigation and all that. Well, Ray Nowaleski was one of the guys who worked on that. Well, then he went further, and he did sequels to Press for Truth. And I think they're just called the Rich Blee podcasts, Podcast 1 and Podcast 2. And one of them is video, the other is audio. But, I mean, they get really way down into the nitty-gritty of just how much the CIA knew and just what they confront Richard Clarke, the White House head of counterterrorism, with what they can prove George Tenet knew and when. And Richard Clarke is basically, you know, upset and is saying, hey, look, there's nothing I can tell you other than he lied to me, the director of Central Intelligence. He lied to me. We'd be up at 3 o'clock in the morning talking about Al-Qaeda on the phone all night long, and he never told me he had 3 real-ass Al-Qaeda in the country all along that I needed to know about, you know, and this kind of thing. And It's really worth watching. And Rich Blee is the name of the guy who was, I forget, I don't know if he was the head at that point or at some point. I think at that point he was the head of the CIA's bin Laden unit, because Michael Scheuer had been banished to the library for getting mad at Sandy Berger for thwarting every attempt to kill bin Laden back in the 90s. And so Scheuer was banished to the library. Civil servants never get fired. They just have to go sit in the library. And so it was this guy, Rich Blee, was part of the, that's why it's called that, Rich Blee, B-L-E-E. And I highly recommend that stuff to everybody. And anyway, but I had a talk with Nowaleski one time, and I asked him, you know, please, just break it down, cut through all the fog. I'm tired of all the fog. Just what really, why in the world, get to the nitty-gritty, why didn't the CIA tell the FBI about these the Al-Qaeda guys in the country so that the FBI could stop them? And what he said, his Occam's razor best explanation is that the CIA panicked because they should have told the FBI all about the Malaysia meeting, and they didn't. And now I forget in the timeline, maybe the Malaysia meeting came later, but it involved some of the guys from the Cole, or maybe it came before, and that was where they planned for the Cole and 9/11. I forget now, Jeff. It's been a little while. But anyway, the point being that the FBI in the 90s was in charge of all the Al-Qaeda investigations, you know, as criminal prosecutions. The embassies in the Cole were turned over to the FBI. And so basically Nowaleski was saying that if the CIA had admitted to the FBI that what they knew about Al-Qaeda in America, they would have had to admit to them what they knew about the Malaysia meeting, and basically that if they had told them about the Malaysia meeting in time, they may have been able to stop the Cole attack. Something along those lines. So basically it was an inter-bureaucratic cover your ass was what it was. And so when it came to having real-ass Al-Qaeda terrorists in the country, the CIA left the FBI in the dark for a year and a half.
Well, and isn't there also a problem? I don't know what it looks like to be, you know, inside government under these conditions, you know, in these high posts in government. But I mean, isn't it the case that like every single day there's just a massive flurry of information coming at you? Some credible, some not. You know, you don't know what's actually a threat and what's just a rumor. What seems to be just like a run-of-the-mill daily problem, and what actually amounts to something serious. It becomes very obvious after the fact. You know, like what you should have known and what you should have shared and what you should have done. But day to day, I mean, I can't even imagine what it must be like. You know, to be, the Secretary of State and get your daily briefing, you know, from the CIA and the FBI and the NSA. There's probably just pages of stuff in there, and after a while, your eyes begin to glaze over. I mean, isn't this one of the problems of unlike insurance companies, you know, who make a business of risk assessment? Mm-hmm. The state, it's just a kind of a constant stream of data coming at you all the time, and I would think it would be very difficult to separate the real threats from just, you know, the usual nonsense.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think, you know, not to let these guys off the hook. People always get me wrong, like I'm trying to let these guys off the hook for calling them stupid, for saying instead of a grand design of an evil conspiracy of Middle East policy, that mostly it's a bunch of idiocy. I don't mean to acquit the people in charge. You know, it's all mendacious stupidity, I mean, if that helps, you know. But there are a lot of times where, and I guess, you know, I really don't know either, Jeff, but it does seem, and hey, I guess some legit experts on my show have said in the past that, yeah, I mean, the kind of discussions that we have on my show, where say I'm interviewing Patrick Coburn about the war in Iraq, something like that a lot of times would be a much better discussion than will take place at the principal level. I mean, maybe the deputy undersecretary of something has that kind of talk with his staff. But by the time the story gets up to Clinton, and here's what we're saying and here's what we're thinking, it's already just a bunch of crap. So, like, for example, and this is a great example, our government has been backing the bad guys, simple as that, in Syria from 2011 on. The al-Nusra, you know, the Mujahideen war against Assad, that includes the al-Nusra Front and now the Islamic State. And so there has to be people in the government. In fact, Fox News just came out and said, oh, we have a DIA report where they warned about the rise of the Islamic State. there are people way down on the chain complaining
but
about
they don't make it all the way up to the top. I mean,
yeah, it doesn't make it up. So by the time
the executive summary doesn't typically foretell the future.
Right.
And
it's just so easy to picture the conversation when it's Obama and Hillary Clinton and the National Security Advisor, and basically it's an exercise in, so this is what we're saying, right? This is what we're saying, and so then this is what we're going to do, right? And it's all about this consensus building, and there's nobody there to say, wait a minute, man. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra is already running around chopping people's heads off and suicide bombings schools full of women and children. Are you sure that they're the lesser evil in this war? If we got to pick one side, it's got to be them. This is crazy. Nobody's saying that at that level. Whereas on my show, week after week, I'm talking with the very best reporters in the world about this, and they're saying to me, "I know, man. It's crazy, but yeah." They are. Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and our guns are in their hands. Sorry.
And part of the problem is that the state doesn't have, sort of ownership over its job in providing security. I mean, it's a job that they're assigned through sort of civic responsibility, but it's not one that's really tied to any kind of profitability metric or scientific approach, so they can choose to take whatever information they want to, act on whatever they want to, they disregard whatever they want to, and there's really no way that they have, as I say, unlike an insurance company, or something like that.
Yeah, well, Rumsfeld famously said we lack the metrics, right? We lack even the tool to measure whether we're creating more enemies than we're destroying, right? But for any of us on the outside, we're going, come on, man, this whole thing, obviously you're creating more enemies than you're destroying,
Right.
But they wonder, how do we even begin to measure this,
Yeah, and your point about consensus building is very interesting to me, too, because that's really what it comes down to. I mean, have you ever been involved in a game of trivia where you sit around, you're on a team of like 4 people? And there'll be a trivia question asked, and you'll get a choice of three possible things. You kind of more or less know the right answer, but you're among 4 people, and there's one person that's kind of passionate that you're wrong. I mean, you very quickly give in. You're like, I'm probably wrong,
That might be me.
Yeah.
The guy that you give into. No.
And then the answer is revealed, and turns out you're right, and your team picked the wrong answer. And you're like, should have just gone with my instincts here, But it's not worth it to you to fight, right. And this kind of mistakes in consensus building happen at the smallest level in society, every day, unless there's a real profitability metric at stake,
Yep.
If you're Tiffany, if you're in charge of security at Tiffany, you've got a very strong incentive and a lot of metrics that are constructed around the likelihood of threats. So you approach everything very different from. It's like government is about like being a part of government intelligence is like being in a casual trivia game in your subdivision. Nobody really has the strong reason to be right. And there's no real great consequence to being wrong.
Yep. Got that right. Hey, I want to ask you some things.
Yeah.
My understanding is that every war in the 20th century, well, every major war, I won't count every time they invaded and massacred a bunch of people in Latin America, but every major war in the 20th century, excluding Korea, the Federal Reserve blew up a gigantic bubble of artificial prosperity to cover the cost of the war and to disguise the consequences when they came later. And I wonder whether you know much about that as far as...
I mean, of course, it all began in World War I, and the studies of this actually came out like right after the war because, as you know, the entire Western world looked back at World War I and said, that was the stupidest thing that's ever happened. How did it happen? Where did it come from, and what can we do to prevent it again? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of war revisionism, like immediately after the war ended, like, holy shit, we were building this beautiful world in the late 19th century, and we decided to blow it up. at tremendous cost and not much benefit. How did this happen? So immediately the economists got to start, and I think his name was William Anderson, was one of the first studies that came out on this, that basically demonstrated that the entire thing was made possible through the central banks. That you had reckless politicians that suddenly, for the first time in history, all faced a kind of unlimited funding, that they could do the war or not, but it wasn't going to cost them in terms of tax revenue. They could just go into deep debt and fund the debt through the central bank. And it was this egregious kind of moral hazard that was created as a result of central banking. I don't believe that the U.S. would have ever entered into World War I were it not for the creation of the Federal Reserve. So that was a result. I mean, that's directly connected, and it's true, of course, even in the case of Russia's involvement in that war. That if it weren't for the Russian central bank, that it never would have engaged in this protracted struggle and draft with Germany and created a hyperinflation, and therefore inspired the revolution that created Soviet communism. I mean, like everything sort of flows out of the central bank. I mean, it's like the original sin in many ways of the 20th century. I mean, much worse than anything else that ever happened. And it certainly happened in World War II, and Vietnam was made possible through this way, and even in modern times, Iraq, and God, I mean, the 2008 financial crisis is directly traceable to Federal Reserve policy following 9/11.
Reagan's arms build up and Bill Clinton's expansion of the empire after, it should have been the peace dividend time. Both of those seem like, the same kind of thing at play too.
What was the first thing you said about Ronald Reagan's build-up? But I mean, that was much earlier, right? I mean, you're talking about
that was
after the Cold War ended.
Right. So I forget, when did they kick Volcker out of there? It was like 83 or 84. They finally lowered interest rates.
Yeah.
And started building up the next bubble.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing because of course we went off the gold standard in 1974 and unleashed this hell, right? So Nixon suddenly is using price and wage controls. We suddenly had inflation plus a recession, creating stagflation, so-called, which wasn't supposed to happen under Keynesian theory. Everything got worse and worse throughout the 1970s. We had the Great Malaise, and then we had the actual serious inflation by American standards, double-digit, which looted American savings and just caused so many disasters. Volcker was appointed by Carter, and then operating under a kind of Chicago-style monetary theory, said, well, look, if you want to get rid of the inflation, you've got to stop the printing presses. I mean, it's kind of an amazing thing in retrospect that actually happened. Like, we can't even imagine that happening now. Just nobody even thinks like that anymore. Like interest rates can't be too low anymore. But Volcker was actually a more or less responsible central banker. He sort of saved the system from itself. And so inflation plummets, but of course we had a deep recession. And we had a real correction. So Reagan becomes president. It's fascinating at the time because his position was, we have to allow the recession to play itself out. We have to get all this malinvestment washed out of the system. We have to get all these bad investments, gone. All the distortions in the economic structure that are created as a result of bad central bank policy have to allow themselves to wash themselves out. And once that happens, we'll be on the road to recovery. All good, all very good instincts, right? But it didn't last long. So as soon as that period was over, and it happened very quickly, I think by 1983 the recession was, we were onward to a growth path and things were looking really impressive. As the Reagan administration used the newfound stability, prosperity, and cleared markets, and the capital that the central bank had permitted to be built up over the previous 3 years of recession, 2 years of recession, to embark on, yes, a massive inflationary monetary policy that was just pure military Keynesianism.
Yeah, and missiles.
And that's what fueled, the so-called prosperity of the 1980s. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that was
really kind of undercut the imperative to give the American people their peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, when Bill Clinton's bubble came in.
That was one of the most egregious times in my life, right? I mean, Scott, it was such a shock because I had been raised in the Cold War, and I more or less believed, like I disagreed with it, but I thought that the reason why we had to put sort of liberty on hold and had to forestall cutting the budget and having a balanced budget and having sound economic policies was because of the Soviet threat. Like I kind of disagreed with that, but I thought that was the actual thinking, you know? So when the Soviet Union just like practically overnight just like vanishes, and all these governments are collapsing all over Eastern Europe, and the 40-year Cold War just suddenly just like evaporates, you know, from the planet. It seemed like an absolute no-brainer. Now is the time. You dramatically cut the military budget, as happened after World War II, actually, and return the money to the American people. And you know, what was funny about that was that the right wing, the Republican Party, wasn't really hip to this idea at all. In fact, there was a great deal of hysteria at the time, like, oh, the threats are still out there. In fact, they're worse than ever. You know, there's new threats emerging. We can't let up on peace through strength, and so on. The people who were most making the most sense at the time were people like Jesse Jackson. Actually, you know, there was a big movement on the left, as you said, for the peace dividend. Now, they didn't imagine it would come in the form of tax cuts. What they wanted to do was convert military spending to kind of domestic welfare and stuff like that, which in a sense would have been actually a better policy. You know, whatever's wrong with domestic welfare, it's less destructive, you know, than endless military buildup. But what was amazing about that whole thing, and in retrospect, it's just astounding to think of how the ruling class just kind of like doubled down, you know,
Yeah,
and
let's
just
go to Iraq.
Yeah, and just pushed through, and figured, look, we'll find another threat, we'll find another war, we'll invent another ruse. The American people are stupid; they'll forget. You know, let's let 2 or 3 years go by, and it'll be a new world, and we'll just kind of keep going on. You know, it's amazing, and it's a measure of the unbelievable irresponsibility of that generation of the ruling class. Because, like I said, after World War I, there were massive cuts, right? After World War II, huge, you know, dramatic shift in national spending priorities, and huge budget cuts, but not at the end of the Cold War. I mean, it was just, there were too many people winning from the military establishments that existed to even consider cutting it back, and it was an egregious situation. Now, let's just say in a perfect world we hadn't had a central bank. I mean, there wouldn't have been an argument. There would have been dramatic cuts all over the place. There had to have been, because you can't possibly tax people to fund the level of Leviathan that we actually live with.
You know
now.
what, though, Jeff? How do you get... And it's funny, because this has been my thing since I started on radio in 1998, was if only I can get all of America to understand about the relationship between central banking and war, and yet, what an obscure thing. I mean, for the Ron Paulians and the hardcore libertarians, we understand. But how do you get the American people to understand that, listen, if they had to raise your taxes, you'd kill them with pitchforks. So instead, they print the money, and you spend all your time in the unemployment line 8 years later wondering why your life sucks, and that's your cost of the war. And so, what? Hate central banking with us now or something? I don't get. What do we do? How do we get people to get it?
Yeah, I don't even think there's much hope for that, actually. I mean, like Ron, you know, he engaged in a kind of a really wonderful campaign to push this, you know, and the book In the Fed, you know, just hammered the point, you know, over and over again, you know, from the first page to the last, that there's this relationship between the loss of liberty and central banking. But I don't know. I mean, it's like this. It's like you said, it's a little too complicated. It takes too many steps, you know, of thinking to get people to understand this.
Oh, sorry. So just barely, though. Too many steps by like one. Like, come on. I don't know. Maybe if you get the right movie stars or rock stars to talk about it or something. You know what I mean?
I don't know. Yeah, and this is why I think
the crash is the correction. Like, someone make a lyric out of that.
Yeah. Well, you know, F.A. Hayek dealt with this whole problem in his own life. If you read his Denationalization of Money monograph in 1974, it's really a fascinating kind of study of just an extraordinarily brilliant man who had spent his, like an astonishingly amazing thinker, who had spent his entire life trying to alert people on in the UK, and continental Europe, and later in the U.S. about the dangers of central banking and the urgency for monetary reform. So 1974 comes along. He's already got the Nobel Prize. He's like, well, to hell with it. I'm just going to tell the truth. And his conclusion was that reform it just can't happen because the ruling class is too wedded to an inflationary monetary policy, and so long as that exists, to his mind, there's essentially no practical hope for freedom at all. So that's when he first concocted this idea of a ground up, sort of a bottom up monetary reform where people just start using a better, more advanced form of currency. Mm-hmm. He imagined it would initially be issued by banks, and he talks about this. I mean, it's very interesting. He has like what I would consider to be an entrepreneurial plan. I mean, he has banks issuing their own currency, and he thinks that people would start accepting it in the event of a monetary crisis because it performs much better and it's much more reliable than national currencies, and that eventually this private currencies will outcompete failed government currencies, and we get a monetary reform by default, not top down because the ruling class doesn't want it, but bottom up because people want a sound money in their own financial interest. So anyway, I tell that story because this is why I'm so hopeful about cryptocurrency. Bitcoin was only invented 6 years ago, and it's like everybody's sitting around going, "Oh, where's the magic? Well, how come your brilliant Bitcoin hasn't overthrown the nation state yet?" Well, all I can say is these things take time.
Yeah, and we're working on it.
Yeah, we're working on it. And the other thing is that we haven't really had a monetary crisis since 2008. I mean, Bitcoin was invented in the Genesis block came out in 2009, but you can see what's happening to Bitcoin in Argentina today. I mean, there's a great story that came out in the Wall Street Journal, which I think was, or maybe it was in the New York Times, but it's an excerpt from a new book on the history of Bitcoin that has swept the country. I mean, everything's, cars and houses. I began to see this 2 years ago. Cars and houses and savings and everything is kept in Bitcoin. It's become a real national currency, an alternative. Well, if that same kind of situation happens in the U.S., we could see a flight into cryptocurrency like we've never seen before, and we could get our monetary reform. All I'm saying is that here's the thing. It's like there's more hope today for this dream of a private currency than we've had in 100 years. That doesn't mean it's guaranteed to happen, or it's going to happen next week, but we have a greater degree of hope now than we've had in 100 years of bad monetary policy. So at least now we have an option should the time come where we need to use it.
Right. Yeah, no, and there's a lot of people around the world, well, everybody's got some kind of crappy paper currency to deal with, so there's going to be crises here and there. And
yeah, I just think it's extremely significant. I think it's something like the invention of cryptocurrency. It's just, plus it's a global currency. It's private. It's not managed by central banks. It's utterly transparent. It's run by a protocol instead of by a bunch of politically appointed criminals, and bloviators or whatever. I think it's extremely significant. I mean, to me, it's like if you think about what did the invention of email mean for the post office over the long term? Initially people said, well, it'll never replace the post office. Now everybody just laughs at the post office. I mean, I go to my mail every day, and mostly what I get is, just junk mail. In fact, by my mailbox, there's a huge trash bin that's entirely full of trash, flyers. It's basically subsidized by the government for the corporate class to send you junk mail. That's what the mails are used for, and so, but it took time for this to happen. So if you think about cryptocurrency and its relationship to national currency, I like to think about, our communication technologies we have now, instant messaging and SMS and, this Google Hangouts or whatever, relative to the only way we had to communicate in the old days, which was through the government. I think it's actually much more significant because when you're talking about money, you're not just talking about one service or one sector. It's not like shoes or vegetables or something like that. It's half of every single economic transaction, So to invent a new form is really, I think, a real hinge of history. And I don't know if that means it's necessarily a Bitcoin, but I think we have a greater hope now for monetary reform than ever before. As for political reform of central banking, I don't believe it. I don't believe it'll ever happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just have periodic crises. I guess they could completely destroy the currency, but then they'd just be replaced by a different central bank is all.
But isn't it? But there is something interesting about all this, because we talked about Volcker and the early Reagan years. The fact that we had something like a political culture that would have tolerated a shutdown of the inflation machine and a culture that tolerated allowing the recession to happen. As if everybody understood, yeah, we made a lot of mistakes in the past, and now we're going to have to suffer for a little while so we can get on a sound growth path. I mean, that's not a complicated story, it seems to me, but it's a story that nobody has told in this country for since that time. I mean, it's been like 30 years since any national politicians told the truth about economic life and the business cycle and the central bank. I mean, why is the truth so completely banned these days? I mean, after 2008, it would have been so easy to say something like, look, we overinflated the economy, now we're going to have to go through a recession. But nobody was willing to say that. It's like, oh my God, recession, let's just, but surely there's some lever somewhere here in Washington where we can make this thing go away. And we're going to do it like now.
They didn't just paint themselves into a corner, right? They paint themselves to the edge of a cliff where if they raise interest rates like Volcker did back then,
right,
then just the interest on the national debt every year would be enough to break the entire national government.
It would be catastrophic.
And so just game over. All they can do is just keep adding zeros to the denominator, basically, and just keep printing dollars.
Yeah.
Until, the apocalypse.
Well, I'm running an article
funded by central banking too.
I'm running an article tomorrow on the Foundation of Economic Education website by Robert Murphy, in which decisively proves, I think, that all the economic policies since 2008 and 9 have been like a complete flop. I mean, it's like been a devastating refutation of Keynesianism. Even by Paul Krugman standards, it's been a disaster. And yet, people still look at it and go, "Oh, that wasn't that great." I mean, Krugman's still out there defending everything. We live in times that's in the same way we're unable to face reality about U.S. foreign policy. It's the same thing with domestic policy. It's like we live in a new age of faith. Where we just have to believe the state, is wonderful and glorious and doing the right thing all the time and has no bad effects whatsoever. I don't know.
And then throw the bums out every 8 or 4 years if necessary to keep the illusion going and switch off, which half of the country is more or less satisfied and which half is more or less angry for a little while and then switch back again. And it works perfectly. And the thing with the boom and the bust, it's the perfect illusion for a regular person who's not thinking hard about it and is just kind of living their life and looking at it. It seems like what happens is the economy's fine, and then it gets bad, and then it gets fine again, and then it gets bad again. And they're not seeing it as an artificial high that then comes the bust is the correction. They just, you could basically fill in any mythology in the why it is that now all of a sudden everybody quit spending money. I don't know why, but they all just did. And that's because that's just how it looks from, the shopkeeper's level or whatever like that. So it's sort of like, again, with central banking and war. How do you get the average person to understand that? In fact, the closest I know to that is a Bob Murphy quote. I was going to bring this up earlier where he says, Scott, all you're complaining about central banking and war, that's a big part of the argument for having a central bank. What if there's a war? We can't have a gold standard. What if we want to kill a bunch of people? And that's expensive, and so we'll have to inflate for that, right?
Yeah.
And that's the only place where you can get to kind of conventional wisdom on the issue is the people who that's why they favor it, so that we can have war all the time. How to get people to oppose it for those reasons is beyond me. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot of reasons for war. Tonight before we talked, I was reading Aristotle's Politics. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to read it. It's a very interesting sort of text of the Western political vision in a way. I mean, it's as egregious as it is brilliant, you know. So it's obviously his pro-slavery stuff is well known, but his presumption of the complete absence of individual rights is fascinating. I mean, reading a text like this makes you really grateful for the Enlightenment in many ways. And there's other brilliant things in it, like he's got a great attack on Plato's collectivism, which you're sort of grateful for in a way. But he has various points about war in there, and essentially he loves war. I mean, he thinks war is just wonderful and inevitable, and he sees war as the tool for becoming rich. That the purpose of war is acquisition of wealth. And to Aristotle's mind, the only real meritorious or viable way to gain more wealth for yourself is to be a member of the ruling class, go to war, and grab it from somebody else. That's how you become wealthy. And that's in his mind. He also thinks that war is very good for bringing out of the human personality, particularly men, this great meritorious desire to rule, to exercise courage, and to be, and to reveal commanding virtues in the human personality. So, I mean, you have this sort of systematic,
Sounds
defense.
like Bill Kristol in the Weekly Standard.
It does. It really does.
National greatness conservatism.
Exactly. That's
Build
exactly
a dam together.
It's amazing. It's straight from Aristotle to the neoconservatives today. I mean, it's just one long line, bypassing the Enlightenment entirely. So reading a book like Aristotle's Politics makes you love the liberal revolution, of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and then finally the great age of laissez-faire, the 19th century, because we discovered the great truth that we don't need all this crap in order to have a good life. We can actually have, freedom. We can make money through peace and trade, and there can be a universal dignity for all human beings. I mean, that is like a beautiful and radical vision. It's so different than anything you read in the ancient world or anything you read from modern status.
Well, that's going on my pile of books I better read someday, I guess. You can see it back there.
It's your eyes pop out, and what's funny about it is that it's extremely erudite. You don't feel like you're reading some weird ancient guy or whatever. He really sounds like a pundit on Fox News.
Hey, listen. Here's where I want to. Oh no, I screwed up. Let me see here. Oh man, I didn't mean to click, but I clicked. Here we go. Here's how I want to end the show today, Jeff. A comment from Tom in the chat room. I don't know. I guess you don't have your chat room open here, but comment from Tom in the chat room. He says, I went to Iraq in 07 and Afghan in 11. We pretty much just protected a warlord's drugs for him. Certainly helped open my eyes to what is going on. The warlord is now dead. Suicide bomber. Live by the sword, as they say, he writes. So this is the American Empire, as he says here, helped open my eyes to what is going on. That's the face of the empire right there. Join up, serve your country, the few, the proud. Now stand there and protect this poppy field, right? And then what would be the opposite of that would be go ahead and kill this guy and all of his village because, the competition poppy dealer doesn't like him anymore, and we're going to call it the virtuous war on drugs, right? Like that's going to be as close as you get to being on the side of right, occupying Afghanistan right there. That's the reality of the empire. And, poor Tom, had to learn the hard way and live through it. Thank goodness he's back here safe and sound, apparently. But, the rest of the guys, the hundreds and hundreds of Americans, more than 1,000 Americans who've died over there in Afghanistan, they were on the same mission as him, more or less. That's basically the face of it. Imagine giving up your child to go and fight in a war that they sell you as some kind of honor and glory and value and defense of America and its freedom and all of this. And then he dies standing around guarding a poppy field. You know, when we all want to legalize opium for medical purposes anyway, man, what are you talking about? You know, why would it even be prohibited, you know, a black market operation in the first place, that he would need all this outside protection? You know, only because we make it that way in the first place. I'm off on the tangent, but you understand. That's the corruption of empire. That's the reality of the empire right there, is go and maybe kill people and get killed over nothing that you could ever talk yourself into if you had a chance to go back, you know?
Scott, thank you so much for your amazing insights. And again, I always use you as my cheat sheet. You know, it allows me to sort of get up on the news that I haven't bothered to read. So thank you for your amazing insight and for your show, Scott Horton Show. Anybody can get it through Googling, right?
Yeah, scotthorton.org.
Yeah, scotthorton.org. And I'm from Liberty.me. If you haven't signed up, do it now.
Hey, I am too.
Yeah, you're from
Friend
Liberty.
me on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I work for the Foundation for Economic Education also, fee.org. That's where I'm posting all the time. And I hope to see you, Scott, in the very near future, and thank you again.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, all the best, sir.
See ya.
Bye-bye.